You're okay. I didn't. Yeah, I didn't RSVP. And
They all do the lecture and they do, well, it depends. Those aren't open. Yeah. Oh.
I'll probably go to some stuff that I'm interested in, but I haven't committed yet. I mean, there's just, I mean, I really need to finish this thing. Yeah, I'm just thinking about what kind of what I need to sit down with that reach. I think questions that I can answer, like each and every one can even try to think of things. I mean, it's just such a, it's a lot of work. However much I want to go to this other things. I guess I should have understood. Now we have 3 years.
Well, welcome everyone. I think we'll start. Welcome to our Fellows Lecture this week with Yue Zhang. Before we start, I wanted to make a few announcements about upcoming events at the Institute. This is our last Fellows Lecture of the semester. We'll have a number of others clearly next semester, but we'll have several other really exciting events going on here, even in the next couple of weeks. Tomorrow, we're beginning our series, our sort of 30th anniversary series that we title Crisis Through the Lens of the Humanities. And our first speaker is going to be Rutgers University historian Toby Jones talking about Devil's Bargain, Oil, Water, and Tyranny in Saudi Arabia. The theme for that is the crisis in oil and water. So I hope you'll all join us tomorrow at 4 o'clock right here. October 30th, just before the election, we're going to have a really interesting program with Victor Margolin, who's from the UIC Design Department, talking about design and democracy. And his talk will be followed by a panel which will include Marcia Lawson, also from the School of Design, and she's one of the people who designed the Chicago ballot. And also Nina Torres talking about the design of democracy. And on October 31st, our two of our working groups are getting together to co-sponsor a speaker. The Health and Society group and the Chicago Area Food Studies group will be hosting Kelly Moore from Loyola, who will be talking about Beyond the Market, Food Cultures Among the Poor. And then finally, I want to mention November 15th and 16th, the Institute is going to host a conference on Holy War. And this is going to be a really interesting 2 days of conversation featuring leading scholars discussing comparative contexts for Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Buddhist holy wars. And these will be both historical and contemporary. So look for more announcements about that. I hope you'll all join us for these events, and you can always get more information on our website. So now I would like to introduce Dennis Judd, who will introduce our speaker today.
As soon as our search committee received Yue Zhang's application for our urban politics position in 2008, we knew we had a future star. This was a binder filled with an exceptional woman. Yue received her BA in International Relations from Peking University in 2002 and her PhD in Politics from Princeton University in 2008. So she really started out as an international studies, and now she teaches urban politics. And Yue, I've heard that you never took an actual course in urban politics. Is this possible?
That's correct.
Well, you wouldn't know it from her vita. Her published work has appeared in journals, reaching across an unusual number of fields. Urban Affairs Review, Town Planning Review, Urban China Review, Perspectives and Studies of International Politics. She received the Norton Long Young Scholar Award in 2009 and the Stone Scholar Award in 2010, both from the Urban Politics section of the American Political Science Association. So to conclude, our search committee did have the right instincts. She has a forthcoming book to be published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2013 under the title The Fragmented City, Politics of Urban Preservation in Beijing, Paris, and Chicago, which explores the discourse and political institutions, how discourse and political institutions shape urban preservation and influences the character of urban development. Did I read that? Did I? Okay. This book was based on an impressive amount of fieldwork, and all you need to know about Yue is that when she went to Paris to do her interviews, she hardly knew any French, and she learned it on the spot and proceeded to interview all sorts of people in Paris. I think this kind of facility will come in handy when she does her research that she's just undertaken on megacities in China, India, and Brazil. You're going to need all
Yes.
She does these tiny little projects. Today, however, Yue is going to talk about still another line of research that she has been engaged in this year at the Institute of Humanities, which explores the relationship between arts and the politics in contemporary China. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you, Dennis, for the very nice, warm introduction. And it's great to see so many of you here, familiar and unfamiliar faces. And I want to say I feel really lucky that I can spend 1 year at the Humanities Institute to explore my research interests on the relations between art and politics in China. And today I'm very happy to share my work with you. And also I noticed that today, the setting of the seminar is different. We're not doing this in the seminar room, but outside. So I want to say especially, thank you for Linda for arranging this. And I really like this kind of open space, no doors and no walls, and we can be more intimate with each other, hopefully. So today I'm going to talk about the relations between arts and politics in China. And my focus is contemporary Chinese arts. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this form of art, so I want to begin by showing you some images. Okay, here are 3 examples of contemporary Chinese arts done by 3 very famous Chinese artists. Contemporary Chinese arts emerged in the late 1970s and the early 80s with China's economic reform and opening up. So many Chinese artists use languages in Western art to illustrate Chinese problems. And many of them are very critical about the political and the social realities in China. So as you can see, for example, the one at the bottom, Execution. It probably reminds you of Spanish artist Goya's painting on shooting. And this is actually a reflection of Tiananmen incident took place in 1989 when the government used military forces to suppress students' demonstration on Tiananmen Square. And here's another one. So what's so special about this one is it was used to be the most expensive work among contemporary Asian arts. So it was auctioned for $10 million in 2008. And the record was actually broken about a year ago by another Chinese artist. So on this one, we see Chinese children are wearing masks and red scarves. So the red scarf is actually a symbol of a student organization in China. So it's under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And all the Chinese kids belong to this organization. They need to wear this scarf every day when they went to school. I did that when I was in elementary school. And so this red scarf symbolizes students' loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. But what I don't understand is, you see their hands. So why their hands are so big and ugly? If you know the answer, maybe you can help me with that. So I must say, not every contemporary Chinese art is politically charged, but usually the most influential ones address political issues. Because of the political sensitive nature of their works, and also their lifestyles is usually different from most people in the society, Chinese artists have been marginalized for a long time. So oftentimes they have to live at the edge of society in so-called artist villages, some underground artist villages, and so they can support each other. But they often face the threat of being displaced because of political decisions or urban renewal. And this is a map of metropolitan Beijing. So here I can show you the locations of the art districts. So you can see the little orange spot on the left side, on the northwest part of the city, Yuan. This is the first underground artist village in China. So basically, it is a ruined imperial palace surrounded by very cheap housing. And also the major universities like Tsinghua University, Peking University are also located in this area. In 1980s, some artists moved in and they turned it into the first artist village in China. So it became really popular. So artists from all over China came there and make it a really vibrant area. And in 1995, it was demolished by the government in the name of improving public safety. And many artists were put into jail. And a few years later, two other artist villages emerged in Beijing at the east side of the city. One is Factory 798. So this is a miniature factory built in 1950s. Another one is Songzhuang town, outside the city of Beijing, but still in the metropolitan area of Beijing. So this time, the government didn't demolish those artist villages. Instead, it designated those as art districts. So here comes my research question. First, why have the political decisions about the underground art communities so profoundly changed? And secondly, given the more tolerant attitude toward the art community, how does the Chinese government actually control the artists and their art production? And finally, what are the implications here? So what can the Chinese case tell us about the relations between political control and artistic freedom and state-society relations in the context of globalization? So before I introduce my own argument, I'd like to talk about some theoretical background of my research. So my research built on three major schools of literature. So many political scientists and art historians write about the tension between art and politics, and many of them demonstrate how artists are suppressed in non-democratic societies. But the Chinese case challenges this notion by showing that suppression is not the only way to deal with artists. And the second school of literature is on state society and globalization. The relations between contemporary Chinese artists and the Chinese state needs to be understood in the context of globalization, because it is globalization that empowers the artists and enables them to present potential challenges to the Chinese state. And there are two major views about how to understand state autonomy in the context of globalization. So according to the globalist view, the state autonomy has been undermined in the process of globalization. However, according to another more critical view about this issue, they argue that state still plays a central role in domestic governance. In particular, they argue that politics defines how global pressures are treated. Domestic politics and political institutions serve as filters that determine what effects globalization really has and how different states adapt to that. So building on this literature, my research tries to show the interaction between the global and the local and try to reconceptualize state-society relations in the context of globalization. And the third school of literature is on art space in cities. So many urban scholars write on this topic. But oftentimes, people consider art districts as a means of promoting economic growth in cities. So oftentimes, people would talk about art districts in the context of culture consumption, tourism, or creative class, or gentrification. And what I find interesting is that the political dimension is largely missing in the discussion. So as a political scientist, I would like to argue that art district is not only an approach for economic growth, it is actually also an effective way for political and social spatial control in cities. And this is my argument. So I'd like to propose a theory of global empowerment and state resilience, and how they lead to the creation of a firewall in the context of globalization. So I argue that Chinese artists are empowered by globalization in that the government has changed its attitude from recurrent suppression to limited tolerance in order to create a better global image for itself. At the same time, the government implements different mechanisms of innovative control to minimize the influence of artists and their artworks as a potential source of political challenge. So the result is, we see a firewall of globalization is created in this process. It facilitates the nation state in creating a better global image for itself, at the same time mitigates the threat of global forces to domestic governance. And in my research, I articulated the three major mechanisms of control: districting, quarantine, and cooptation. So districting is about controlling the location of the arts. Basically, the government designates certain areas as art districts and influence the spatial allocation and daily activities of artists through the planning tools or leasing policies. A second strategy is called quarantine. It's about controlling the distribution of the arts. Basically, the government blocks the channels of publication, exhibition, and circulation of artworks. And the third strategy is called cooptation. It's about controlling the production of the arts. So many artists are recruited into official art institutions, and they received some respectable titles. So together, those three mechanisms allow the government to control the art communities and to fulfill its own political and economic purposes. In the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about those strategies one by one and to give you some examples and see how those mechanisms really work in Beijing. And let's begin by talking about districting. Let's see how those organic art communities were taken over by the government and reshaped into art districts. Okay, let's begin from Factory 798. So this factory has a very glorious past. Like I mentioned, it was used to be a military factory. It is the largest segment of 718 joint factory, built under the leadership of Chairman Mao, and provided advanced technological support for Chinese armies. And was built in the 1950s with lots of technical and funding support from Soviet Union and Eastern Germany. So, for example, the photo on the top shows you the construction of the factory, and the photo on the, at the bottom shows you how the Bauhaus-style workshop look from the outside. And was used to be the largest factory complex in Asia, and a kind of a symbol of China's industrialization and international socialist cooperation. But this factory began to decline in 1980s. So it was against the background of China's economic reform, because the government wants to reduce the share of state-owned enterprises in the entire national economy. And also, Beijing began to deindustrialize its local economy in 1990s. So Factory 798 was downsized from a state-level SOE to a municipal level one. It's renamed as Beijing 7 Stars Group in 2000. And by 2001, you see several factories were closed, and about 3/4 of the workers were laid off. So the factory began to lease out some of the space for revenue. And here come the artists. So artists came here. First group arrived in 2001. They were attracted to this place because of the low rent and the huge space, and also the Bauhaus-style workshop offered a very unique space for art exhibition. Here, let me show you a picture. So this is the interior of an art gallery at Factory 798. And you can see the Bauhaus-style workshop has a really cathedral-like interior. It has really high ceiling, very spacious, and the natural light going in through the window. And also those socialist or industrial legacies are well maintained. We can still see the factory machines. And also on the ceiling, the red slogan says, "Long live Chairman Mao." So as you can imagine, you're exhibiting some avant-garde artworks, some contemporary and modern work in this kind of socialist setting. It's actually very cool. The visual effect is very stunning. So more and more artists came to this area, and they make it really internationally famous. So lots of international journals and magazines ranked Factory 798 as one of the top art districts in this world. Well, however, this area faced the threat of being demolished back to 2003. So the Seven Stars plan is to demolish the whole factory and build a high-tech park because it's supposed to be more profitable. So I prepared to have the demolition in 2003, and I remember when I did my first round of interviews with artists back to 2003, many of them told me, well, maybe this is your last trip here because the whole area will be demolished very soon. And artists actually launched a campaign to preserve this factory area. And what really helped the artists was the international reputation of this area. So like I mentioned earlier, it became really internationally well known. And many foreign officials visited the Factory 798. And it has become a symbol of Beijing's rising as a global city. Also, the national government played a very important role in protecting this area. Especially one figure, his name is Li Changchun. He is one of the 9 Politburo Standing Committee members in China. So one of the 9 most powerful politicians in China. And he's in charge of issues about culture, arts, publicity. So he's considered as China's propaganda chief. So when people ask him the situation in Factory 798, ask him for advice, he just said 9 Chinese characters, like I listed here. He said, 看一看, 论一论, 管一管. Okay, now maybe you don't understand it. That's a purpose. Yes, so to translate that into English, it means have a look, have a discussion, and have a regulation. Okay? It's very concise, but it's also very vague, right? So basically, the government doesn't really know what it's going to do with this vibrant art community here. But we see the basic attitude here is now to demolish it. So very quickly, the Beijing municipality designated this area as an art district. So officially named Beijing Cultural Creative Industry Cluster. So in other words, the factory escaped the fate of being demolished and began to be institutionalized, legalized as an art space in Beijing. And I talked to one artist about, the interesting stories of preserving this art district. He was one of the first artists moved into this area, and also one of the 2 leading figures in this campaign. So I asked him, so what do you think? Why the Chinese government decided to save this area? And he told me something like this. He said, contemporary art had always been considered by the Chinese leaders as flood and beast. That is, a tool of the West to subvert the Chinese government. But after Beijing won the bid of the Olympics, the government needed such a place to create a more open, tolerant image for itself. It also became more confident and realized the threat of contemporary arts is not so big. But the government still maintains high degrees of wariness towards us. Okay, so we can see that the image value of the art community played a very important role in persuading the government to maintain this culture space. And the global event definitely is important here. But we need to remember, the creation of this kind of global culture space is actually for political purposes. Now let's take a look at what happened to Factory 798 after it was designated as the art district. So there are some major changes. The first thing the management office did was to ban the independent art festival run by the artists. And it launched a new art festival organized by the office and claimed it as the only legal art event in this area. And also the rent of the area became really high. So many grassroots artists cannot afford to stay here. They were displaced by some world-famous art institutions. So for example, Woolens Foundation opened a Woolens Contemporary Art Center in this district. And also Pace Gallery opened Pace Beijing. That what I heard is the first branch of Pace Gallery outside New York City. And also we see the shrinking of art space in Factory 798. So art production and exhibition is no longer the major activity there. It is kind of marginalized by some commercial activities like fashion shows, product marketing, and movie premieres. So lots of gallery owners told me they just cannot make money by leaving their space to artists they have to work with some companies in order to make more money for themselves. And also Factory 798 has become one of the most popular tourist destinations in Beijing. Last time when I was in Beijing, I went to a bookstore and I saw a tour guide in Beijing. When I opened it, it says, if you go to Beijing, if you come to Beijing, you have to see the Forbidden City. You have to see the Great Wall. You have to see Factory 798. Okay, so now you know where you should go if you go to China. Now let's take a look at some images about how the urban space of the art district is shaped. Okay. So two photos on the right shows you the spatial arrangements, both at night and during daytime in this art district. And the one on the left upper part shows you is actually outside a art gallery in Factory 798. And here there are of course dragons and sculptures in this area. And here's another one. Okay, Charman Mall in Factory 798, and actually many Charman malls here. So this is a story about how Factory 798 was eventually reshaped into an official art district in Beijing. And now let's move a little bit to the east, see what happened to Songzhuang. Okay, so as you see the location of Songzhuang on this map, this is actually a town in metropolitan Beijing. It's about 20 kilometers away from the center of the city, but the main activities there for a long time was agriculture. So actually for people living in the city, they consider Songzhuang as a countryside or as farmland. And what happened to Songzhuang was very similar to the story in Factory 798. There was an organic underground artist village, but also it was taken over by the government. And right now the town government is proposing building the biggest art district in China. So artists first moved into one village in this town. This village is called Xiaopu. It is actually the poorest of all those 47 villages in Songzhuang. And artists came over in mid-1990s after the demolition of Yuanmingyuan Artist Village. They were attracted to this area because the space is really big and the rents were really low. And also because it is outside the center of the city, there were fewer policemen and the political control is relatively loose. So the village committee played a very important role in allowing the artists to come in. And the village committee is a self-governance body in China, elected by villagers. It is not an official level of a government, but it makes all the important decisions in the village. And the number one figure in charge of the committee is called the CCP party secretary. I had several conversations with the party secretary when I was in Beijing a few years ago. And I asked him why he allowed the artists to come into this village. He told me because they can buy the houses or they can rent the space, so they can actually help the villagers increase their income. And he heard some of the people who come in were painters. So I asked him, do you know they were doing contemporary arts? And he looked at me and said, what contemporary arts? Never heard of it. So because of his support, many artists settled down in Xiaopu village. And there was a growing number of artists there. So it also drew the attention from the town government and the district government. So in 1997, the district government named Xiaopu village as one of the two most unsafe places in Tongzhou. And the main reason is there are so many artists. Luckily, the artist was supported by the party secretary of the village committee, and so by 2004, land leasing, became the most important source of income for the villagers in this village. So because of the economic value of the art community, the town government actually changed its attitude. So in 2004, the town government proposed to build the largest art district in China, including Xiaopu. And 2 years later, their proposal was supported by Beijing municipality. So the whole area was designated again as an art district, officially named the Cultural Creative Industry Cluster. So it has the same status as Factory 798. So we begin to see lots of changes in this area. We see rapid urbanization of rural land in Songzhuang. So lots of villagers' houses were demolished and replaced by new art studios or museums or galleries built for the artists. And also about 18,000 villagers are to be relocated to high-rise apartment buildings nearby. And so there were many artists came into this area. By the end of 2000, more than 3,000 artists came into Songzhuang town, and 900 of them are living in Xiaopu. Also, the rapid increase of artists actually also leads to the growth of different types of creative and service industries in this area. So, including stores that sell materials for artworks, and also framing stores or restaurants or like advertising companies or animation companies. And okay, here are two photos of the art galleries and museums in Songzhuang. The one on the top shows you a giant art gallery in Songzhuang, and the one on the bottom is actually outside the art museum in this area. So as you can see, the setting is very vacant. It's really kind of in the middle of nowhere. And you see those giant art facilities there. It's quite interesting. Another one. So this is a newly built residence for artists in Songzhuang. And I want to say a few words about the architect. So this is a very young Chinese architect who designed those complexes. And she got her degree from Harvard University. And then she worked for Ram Koolhaas in his firm, OMA, for a few years. And then she came back to China and won a competition, so designed this architecture here. So we can see the whole story of the design or of the making of the space here is very international. And some villagers told me that nowadays they don't grow potatoes or peanuts, they grow arts. So indeed, they are growing arts. So when Songzhuang was designated as art districts, we also begin to see lots of changes. So besides the rapid urbanization and the spatial changes, there's also the increase of the level of rent and the overall land value in this area. So many artists cannot afford to stay here for a long time. Like many artists told me, probably 50 to 60% of the artists cannot afford to stay for more than 2 years here. So they have to move to places further away. And also, art festival is taken over by the government as a showcase. So one artist told me this: art festival in Songzhuang is purely government behavior for the sake of advertising only. Just like some places hosting watermelon festival, if they grow good watermelons, cucumber festivals, if they grow good cucumbers. So I guess for Chinese officials, arts is really not different from watermelons or cucumbers. And also many artists told me during the festivals, they really experienced a severe censorship in terms of what can be exhibited and what cannot. And there are many police forces, both in uniform and in plain clothes, walking around during the art festivals. So after I shared with you the stories of Factory 798 and Songzhuang, we know how districting is used as a strategy to control the location of artists and their works. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the other two strategies, quarantine and cooptation, to see how the government controls the circulation and the production of artworks. We know artists' autonomy is always constrained, no matter if it is in an authoritarian regime or in a democratic society. So for example, in the Soviet Union, the artists can only celebrate certain themes in certain forms. That's why we see the creation of socialist realism in the Soviet Union back to the 1930s. And in the United States, many artists and curators told me that they have experienced a post-9/11 criminalization of artists in the society. So in China, artists actually have lots of autonomy in creating, the art that they want to do, in addressing political issues in their works. But they told me that they can do that as long as they don't go beyond the red line. So I asked them, what is the red line? They told me, basically the red line is you don't directly condemn the Chinese Communist Party or the major leaders like Chairman Mao or Chairman Hu. So I think a very important reason here, the artists have some autonomy in art creation is because the Chinese government can effectively control the channels of publication, exhibition, and circulation of artworks. In other words, you do whatever you want. There's no way for you to show your work to the public. How good is that? During my interviews, I talked to an artist and also a gallery owner at Factory 798. He told me he recently produced a group of photographs because he is a photographer. So he used a prostitute as a model. And on those photographs, this model standing naked, besides different groups of men, all those men were in clothes, wearing different types of apparels. So he told me the meaning of this work is to show people that prostitution is a very serious problem in China. And it is not something related to poor migrant workers, but also to different social groups, including the middle class, including government officials. However, this is something considered as a dark side by the Chinese government. And it is not something the government wants people to talk about publicly. So he told me there's no way for him to show his work publicly. And then he found a way to exhibit his work. And this is some of the words offered by him. He said, this kind of work can't be publicized in China. There's absolutely no way for me to advertise it in any newspaper or magazine. The only thing I can do is to display it in my own gallery. Even the display was quite sensitive at the very beginning. People from the management office came here and looked at my works for a long time. They obviously understood the political implication of my work, but I tried to make it as implicit as possible. So eventually they thought it was fine to just show it here. We have to say this artist is very lucky because he has a gallery to show his work. And for many Chinese artists, there's no way for them to show their work to the public. And many artists told me that during major events or before the major events, lots of policemen or local officials would come over to their studios to check their works. And if they see something which is controversial, they would ask the artist to cover them up or to turn the work around so people cannot see if they come to the studios during the major holidays. And so many artists told me that they feel their works are quarantined domestically and for export only. But I have to say that there are some challenges for Chinese artists in recent years, because we know the global economic downturn brought lots of negative impact to the global art market. So the demand for contemporary Chinese arts is also decreased. So many Chinese artists have to return to domestic market. And in order to be successful domestically, they often need to have some support from the government. So it actually places the Chinese government at a better position to control the artists. So that leads to the third mechanism I want to talk about. It's about co-optation. So in 2009, the Chinese government created the Contemporary Art Academy of China. This is only and the first official national institution on contemporary arts. It is a semi-governmental agency supervised by the Publicity Department of CCP, Central Committee, and the Ministry of Culture. So 22 very well-known Chinese artists were appointed as academicians as soon as the academy was created. And I have to say that all those 4 artists that I mentioned at the very beginning, they are right now academicians of this academy. They were appointed right away by the Chinese government. So we can consider this as achievement because since the government began to recognize the status of Chinese artists. However, many Chinese artists told me that they think very differently. So for example, one artist told me this. Contemporary art, in fact, has not been elevated from something outside the political regime to something inside. What the government has done is like how the Jade Emperor tamed the Monkey King. He gave him the title of Bima Wen. The Monkey King thought it was a prestigious position and was very happy. But in the end, he realized it was nothing. It was just a trivial position to take care of the emperor's horses. Many artists came from the grassroots, so they consider the recognition from the political regime very important. and they are willing to accept amnesty and serve the ruler. If you are familiar with Chinese literature, you will know Monkey King is a very mysterious figure with lots of magic power. But he seems to become so naive in front of the Jade Emperor. Maybe you can say the same thing about the Chinese artists. And another Chinese artist, he was pretty successful domestically, shared a very similar view. He said, the government doesn't consider us as artists. It only considers people in the China Artists Association as artists. So some background information. The China Artists Association was a government-controlled art organization created in 1949. So all the official artists belong to this organization. So this is like part of the Stalinist way of governing the art world. So China adopted the system as soon as the regime was created. And then he said, we are considered as the rebels, like Robin Hood. The goal to establish the Contemporary Art Academy is to offer amnesty and enlistment to rebels. The academician is a very prestigious position, but there's one thing. You cannot badmouth the CCP anymore. The several leading artists are very influential. As long as they shut their mouth, the rest of the art community will be silent. Right, so during my interviews with artists, I actually see the words, like rebels, Robin Hoods, or amnesty came out very frequently. So I think those metaphors show us a severe tension between the government and the artists. And so for many artists, the creation of the academician is actually a way for the government to co-opt the leading artists and through them to control the entire art community. We know the title of the academician is probably very symbolic, but it can be desirable for the artists in China because they have been marginalized for such a long time. Now I want to quickly conclude. We see from the Chinese story that the state both needs and restricts creativity. So in the process of globalization, certain social forces like the artists are empowered and they present challenge to the state autonomy. However, the state is not powerless. It shows a significant extent of resilience, to use different mechanisms to mediate the influence from the outside world and from certain social groups. So we see a firewall of globalization is created in this process, and we see some ironies here. Globalization, although is often thought to threaten state sovereignty, can under certain circumstances aid the process of state formation. And subversive art, when skillfully managed, can serve the very powers it challenges. And finally, I want to offer some reflections about the future of contemporary Chinese arts. We know arts is always influenced, constrained by politics and market forces. But what's interesting about the Chinese case is that contemporary Chinese arts have often constantly been shaped and reshaped by the outside world. So Western audience tends to project certain views or values on contemporary Chinese arts. And this kind of projection, to a large extent, reflects how they see China. So actually for a long time, Chinese artists try to cater to this kind of taste. So I talked to several art critics in New York City and also here in Chicago, and they told me they feel that contemporary Chinese arts are very national, very political. But we have to know that this kind of strong national and political identity is to a large extent reinforced by the outside world. During my interviews with Chinese artists, many of them talked with me and showed me their concern about the future of contemporary Chinese arts. So many of them told me they want to go beyond the Chinese context and they want to adopt a more global vision in their work, but they have yet to figure out how to do so. During my interviews and my entire field work with the artists, I keep thinking about one question, that is, what can contemporary Chinese arts and China offer to the world? For both contemporary Chinese arts and the Chinese society, right now is a very confusing time. It is also a very exciting time. I think I'm going to end my talk with those uncertainties, and now I'm happy to open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you. Yes, thanks.
There's Sharon Zukin has written about the role of arts in the spatial artists in New York, and the way in which artists were a force to sort of colonize neighborhoods that were marginal. They in turn tend to get pushed out when those neighborhoods become seen as fashionable in Soho. And that, so you don't have the state, but you do have displacement. And then this whole issue of commercialization, of course, any art is subject to that. So I wonder if you just have some responses to that.
Yes.
Degree to which the Chinese experience is utterly unique or has some reflection elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think the point that you made here is that besides the influence of the state, we actually also see the influence of the market, especially in the case of New York City, like what Sharon Zukin mentioned, right? The entire process of gentrification or commercialization. And I think this is something we have, is happening everywhere, including in China. So for example, here, one of the focuses of this research is to show how the political actors influence art space and also influence the production of artists. But as we see in those two art districts, especially in Factory 798, those space has also been commercialized rapidly. So that's actually very similar to what Sharon Zukin described in her book, Loved Living, about what happened to artists in Soho. But I think the difference here is try to show in the different political and social contexts, especially in the authoritarian regime, we need to pay more attention to how the political force actually shapes the urban space. Yeah. But actually, that's a very valid point, because I don't want to underestimate the influence of market, in commercializing art space and also in reshaping those art space. But just I feel like the political actor is sometimes something people tend to ignore in this process. And actually, just to add on that, not only in terms of the gentrification or commercialization of space, but also if we think about who are the patrons of contemporary arts, oftentimes it's really kind of the really rich people in the society. Like I read an article a few days ago written by an art historian based in Los Angeles, and she said it's really the 1% people of the income level who are the patrons of contemporary arts worldly. So we can still really see the the influence of market and money on arts. Yes, Steve?
So on your question, what can contemporary Chinese art offer the world? The opening slide you had was more profound. This slide, at least as best I can see it, is not very profound as an art statement. I may be missing something, but that's my first read of it. I guess the question is, in what art from a particular place offers the world is a particular insight that, while particular, has universal human meaning. Again, I don't see much in this set of slides. I did in the first set of slides, but they also tended to be a particular revolt related to China. Do the contemporary Chinese arts offer universal themes that, say, someone from Brazil or someone from India or someone from the United States seeing the art would take away an insight that had universal quality that applied to them in their other very different circumstance?
Well, I think the Chinese artists, they are definitely trying to embrace a more global vision in the works. In other words, they don't want to make their work just look like Chinese artists' works. They actually want to address certain global or worldly issues. But it seems right now the dilemma or the problem for many Chinese artists is that they're facing a bottleneck. They don't really know how to do that. So many of them feel that they're just recycling the symbols which were created in the 80s or in the 90s. Or they are just making those really direct political statements in order to make their work look like Chinese or interesting to the Western audience. But that's actually something they want to avoid. However, they have not yet figured out how to do so. I don't know whether that addresses your question directly, but yeah. But I think there's certainly the the motivation for the artists to do so, to become more global. But I think they're still searching the way of doing so. Yeah.
I have a related question. I really enjoyed your talk. Some of the themes you raised seem to resonate with some of the comments in the popular space, public space raised by people in China and abroad after Mo Yan, the author, the Chinese author who won the Nobel Prize.
Oh, yes.
So he's the person that sort of, similar to what you discussed, he has been co-opted because he's the vice president of the China's Writers Association, and he also doesn't cross the red line, he stays within it. But then he produced work that's parallel to Marquis, similar to the comments used earlier, there's universal humanistic vision. So I was wondering whether there's a side to arts that's independent from politics and very individually based, very much up to one person's vision of volition, regardless of how government quarantines it, controls it. That might be something. I was just wondering what you think about the comments about Mo Yan, how that relates to your questions.
Okay. I'm not sure if all our audience are familiar with Mo Yan. He's a Chinese writer and recently received Nobel Prize, right?
Yeah, the first thing he said when he was giving the speech that my name is Shut Up. That's his pen name. So it's very similar to what you were saying.
I really don't have any particular knowledge about this writer in particular, but from my fieldwork and my interviews with some of the artists and also some writers in China, they told me actually they feel very similar things. They are facing a similar situation. In other words, if they want to succeed, they have to be part of the system, and they have to give up something in order to gain support from the Chinese government. And they told me actually that's a very similar thing. So probably that's echoes what you said about Mo Yan. Yeah, but did you read his work?
Yeah, I loved it when
Oh,
I was
really?
in college. I think it's great. He's a great writer. So I was wondering about these because people said he's not political enough, or the Nobel Prize has now become not political enough. So whether that's even an issue for artists.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Here, then Bob. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I had just 2 points. One was more of observation and one was a question. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
I think, from the point of view of an urbanist, I think something like this is marvelous because it, the whole sort of urbanist or global cities sort of literature, I think this shows us that the global city is really not a solid object, right? I mean, in fact, it's this interrelated, this absolutely endless bunch of networks and politics and negotiations between various people. So I think that it, your work really seems to, from the point of view of an urbanist, I think is really marvelous for that very reason, apart from various other things. But my question to you was, the question is really on your idea or your suggestion of the co-option or the co-optation of the artist, and I'm wondering, does this really restrict creativity, or does it in fact give rise to a whole bunch of, what does it actually do to the art? I'm wondering if it actually makes the artist, and whether you've noticed the actual art, if you've done an analysis of how this policing of the state, perhaps, does it, in fact, enhance the creativity? Does it actually make artists, and I know that one of those quotes from one of the artists, I'm wondering if does the art actually change and become less explicit? Do the artists find different ways in which to do the same thing through their material expressions? And perhaps maybe they are not as co-opted as we might imagine, but in fact, policing enhances creativity?
Okay.
I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on that.
Sure. Thank you. I comment to both points. First of all, well, thank you for your comment on the global city vision, and I really agree with you. I think probably the whole notion of global city or globalization needs to be reconceptualized in terms of how the local actually plays in an important role, and makes this process more interactive rather than top down. Rather than certain impact from the global, from international forms on the local people. It's really like the interactive process between the local and the global. And my criticism about globalization or global cities literature always is that people tend to take it as a top-down pattern and look at what happened to those cities on a rather superficial level, so that we see the facades, but we don't know what's behind those facades. So oftentimes, actually, similar global space is created in Paris, in London, in Beijing, in New York, in Chicago. They look very similar, right, with parks, restaurants, culture space. However, the dynamics of how they are created are very different, and those are actually constrained by the local conditions. So I hear you, and that's actually one of the really interesting things that I would like to explore more about how global space is shaped. In terms of how the local forces actually plays an important role here. And so the question, if I understand that correctly, your point is, whether the artists are trying to find different ways of expressing their opinions, maybe in a more subtle way, so they can avoid the political censorship to some extent, right? Is it your question?
No, my question is really, does the art really change?
Yeah.
As a result of this policing? Is it simply that it's censored, or is there a real distinct material change in the forms of expression that might not be necessarily co-opted, but a different kind? So I'm just wondering. Yeah.
Some artists actually, they begin to use different languages in their works. They become more subtle. Now, actually, not so in Beijing, but more in artists in other parts of China, in Shanghai, for example. Many artists, they begin to use some more subtle languages of expressing their views. And also another trend is, many artists, they simply stop addressing political issues in their works. So they begin to address something else, maybe something about the society in general, or about the market economy, or they tend to have some reflections on some other issues. So for example, one of the quotes says that after the artists became academicians, they need to shut their mouth, right? So actually, I'm not trained as an art historian or an artist, so I don't think it's really legitimate for me to say so. But I did some research on the works of the artists who were appointed as the academicians, and you can actually see some of them changed the topics from something more political to something more apolitical. So again, like I said, because I don't really have expertise on this topic, so I cannot really say they changed the topic because they are the academicians now. But I think the point of the quotes here is that we cannot ignore the influence of those political mechanisms on those artists. And again, I think I want to add one more thing, that is, there is also the geographic variation among Chinese artists. So Chinese artists in Beijing, because that's a capital, really the center of the political struggles in China, so they tend to be more political than artists in other parts of the country. So like in Shanghai, for example, I heard artists usually tend to be less political than their counterparts in Beijing. Yes, and Bob?
That was actually along the lines of what I was going to say. I'm a little uneasy with the way you talk about contemporary Chinese art and contemporary Chinese artists as if it's one thing, it's homogenous. Now, if you were looking at the United States, for example, and you went to the galleries in Soho and you read the magazines, you would think that it's about avant-garde art, but actually that's a tiny, tiny amount of the production in the United States. Actually, most art here is very conservative, and it's by people like Leroy Neiman and people like that. They sell in aggregate much more than the the Andy Warhols and the Koons and so on. My guess is, and I don't know much about this, is it is exactly the same in China, that the overwhelming amount of art is actually, contemporary art is actually fairly conservative and it's apolitical. So I think what you're probably looking at here is a very specific case where Westerners, because of the avant-garde tradition that we have, that they didn't have in China because of political circumstances, go there looking for specific things. They're looking for Chinese imagery and they're looking for subversive content, because that's what we think art, at least the high art world here thinks art should be. So none of this takes away anything from what you said, just to recognize that you may be looking at the tiniest sliver of the art world in China.
Yes, thanks. That's a good point. So actually, that actually echoes to what we just talked about in terms of the variation among the Chinese artists and also their works. And I want to say, a very important reason I decided to focus on this form of art is really because, like you said, there's the Western projection on those arts. And probably that's also the reason why those artists are really internationally so famous. And especially, you take a look at the pioneering works made in the 80s and the 90s. Actually, most of them, they address the political issues. So I guess that's why I began to do research on this form of art. But then when I know more about the art world in China, then I begin to realize really this is a really more diverse, a world of diversity. So like what you said, and also the difference in terms of the generation of artists, and the difference in terms of the location of the artists. Yeah, so that's a good point. I think I'm going to incorporate thoughts like that in the work that I'm doing. Yeah. Yes. Sure.
I wonder, my question is kind of a historical question, and you started out by saying that Chinese artists were traditionally marginalized. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, and also this sort of what the status of artists was, sort of in a historical sense, and how different this actually is from, say, state patrons in an earlier era, or just where it fits into a kind of longer trajectory for artists and their relation to the state in China.
Right. Okay. Yes. So I guess maybe we can begin the story from 1949, unless you want me to go back to 2,000 years ago. So I guess maybe you're talking about more, in contemporary China, right? From the Chinese.
Well, I was actually
Party.
thinking
Yeah.
farther back in the sense of, was 1949, a blip, or is there some kind of continual
Right.
or consistent strain that is going?
Right. Yes. So actually, I guess every political regime wants to put certain constraints on artists, right? Because back to Plato, when he said we need to ban artists from the Republic, we know political authorities, they are always scared about what artists say. And because artists always can be considered as a threat to the social or the political stability. So in China, actually, before 1949, there was also the constraint from the state on artists. However, it was really not very much institutionalized. It is not very severe as what it was after 1949. So, for example, I heard a story back to Yuan dynasty. It was really long time ago. Like there was a very famous Chinese artist. He was really because Yuan was not established by Han Chinese. Yuan was the dynasty created by the Mongols. So the artist was a Han Chinese, and he was very upset. So he showed his anger in his work. What he did was he drew lots of birds in his work, in traditional Chinese ink painting. But all those birds looks like very upset and angry. Like looks like their eyes were rolling the eyeballs or something like that. And also his signature on this painting is actually, if you read that just literally, it says 8 mountain, something. It's like a pen name. However, what he really means by writing those characters, or you can read it in a different way, it actually reads, laugh at it, and cry at it. So in other words, it is an artist to show that he was very sad about, the Chinese empire was taken over by the ethnic minorities. So anyway, it is just one small example to show that artists they still try to express their anger back to the ancient era. However, the political control of artists was not really institutionalized in that time. And then, when we come to 1949, the Chinese government began to institutionalize really severe control of the artists. So like one artist mentioned in the quote, there's the organization called the China Artists Association. So it was the only legal association for Chinese artists, so controlled by the Chinese government. So the artists needs to have certain official status, admitted by the Chinese government. And as long as they have this status, they will become a member of the association. Then they are legalized. Otherwise, no one can exist outside the political system. And so this kind of China Artists Association is kind of the Stalinist way of governing the artists. And then it was, began to be established in China in 1949. Until nowadays, it still works. So, but then when we came to 1980s, things began to change because there were artists began to emerge outside the regime. Those are the contemporary Chinese artists. So that's why we see lots of tensions and struggles here between the art world, between the art communities and the Chinese state. So in other words, I think we have to say there was always the constraints on the artists from the Chinese political regime, but it was really reinforced and institutionalized in 1949. And then, after 1970s and 80s, we see this kind of chaotic situation because of the emergence of contemporary Chinese artists. They claim as artists, but they're outside the political system. Yeah.
I have kind of a naive question about this, which is, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about communism and capitalism in relation to the art. In other words, I'm imagining that there's a certain kind of communist ideology that would be artistically expressed in China, like in the Soviet Union, like social realist art. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the relationship between those tropes of communist or proletarian art and the pressures being placed on contemporary artists. That's on the one hand, and then capitalism. I would think that the Chinese state's relationship to rapid capitalist development today would be relevant to what the artists are commenting on. In other words, if art is going to be politically critical, one thing it might be critical of wouldn't just be political, like Tiananmen Square, but would be critical, say, of capitalist development or commodification in the way that we think of contemporary art in the West, often having a kind of comment on commodification. And I see the picture here with Chanel No. 5, where you had mentioned the artist commenting on prostitution. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how contemporary art relates to communist ideology on one hand and capitalist development on the other, critically or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think contemporary artists, especially Chinese artists, they tend to be really critical about both communism ideologies and the communist political ideologies and also the capitalist economy in China. Because I think China is really kind of a really weird combination nowadays. Because although the constitution says it's still a socialist regime, in reality you see everything is capitalized. However, the major force behind the market activity is actually the government, is actually not really private sectors, because the government, they can monopolize the resources, market opportunities, and many officials or local government, they are involved in the market activities. So I think China is kind of really this really weird combination of capitalism, socialism, political ideology, and also this kind of worship for materialism, all sorts of things. And Chinese artists, I think they're critical about all those issues. And I think really at the very beginning, back to the 70s and 80s, I think their main target is political ideology or socialism, or the legacies from Maoist era. So like we talked about earlier, they tend to make the really direct political statement in their work, like to criticize the political legacies from Maoist era, and they want to have more democracy in the society, and they want to, advocate for freedom, for political freedom in particular. But I think nowadays it seems that the artists begin to pay more attention to the influence of capitalism on society, especially in terms of how capitalism has eroded, the moral standards in the society, and also how capitalism or market economy reshapes people's, interpersonal relations and influence people's value about many things in China. So I think nowadays there's a change that people begin to pay more attention. Artists begin to pay more attention to how to how to speak to the capitalism impact in China. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Oh, this may echo the question about the creativity, sort of the increase of creativity by imposing more constraints. But I was wondering if, I just want to continue in that direction. Is there, what is the influence of the academy, the academized art on market? I mean, because if the influence is sufficiently great, I suspect, paradoxically, by joining the academy, you will be able to get more freedom because you actually produce more money for the state. Mm-hmm. Something like that. So, do you see that? I mean, and then I wonder if the red line, right, gets moved. Have you seen any examples of where, something that used to be the red line, but now is sufficiently kind of can be transformed into money or influence or kind of creating, local economies? Mm-hmm. Have you seen where the red line has moved? Yeah. Well, so yes, somehow the standards for crossing the line has gotten higher. Right.
Well, to answer the second question first, I think the Chinese leaders are actually very strict in terms of how to draw the line, how to draw the red line, where to draw the red line, and how to keep the red line. So, in other words, between the white and the black in China, you see a large gray area. Okay. However, from my observation, I feel the red line is actually pretty stable, and it has been there. So the government is actually doing a really good job in terms of maintaining the red line. So for example, the red line means you cannot really publicly condemn Chinese Communist Party or those major leaders. And actually, I think the threshold is actually pretty low already. So that the artist actually has a huge gray area in which they can use their creativity. But just that you don't do that very directly in terms of criticizing the party or the government. And another thing is, but I think that's a good observation, because to understand many things in China, you need to understand there's always a gray area, and the gray area is actually changing. So oftentimes the government doesn't really make the regulation or the policies very clear, because they want to leave the gray area for people to manipulate, or maybe for the officials to manipulate. Mm-hmm. And that maybe goes back to the very practical political philosophy in China, which has been influencing people for such a long time. Like in the economic reform, Chinese leaders would say, no matter it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as you can catch mice, you're a good cat. Mm-hmm. So which means no matter capitalism, socialism, it's okay. As long as the economy is going well, then perfect. So this is kind of philosophy I think is really influential, but I really think the red line is still quite stable, it's still quite strict. So about the first question is the impact of the academy, right? So whether that can make the artists more successful.
More successful and more
Domestically.
successful in not just economically, but in kind of actually making more space for themselves, right? I mean, I'm trying to kind of get back to the question earlier about the constraints somehow make artists more subversive in their messages. But also you can, since the Academy is a political body, I suppose, right? And it's now integrated into the Communist Party. I mean, how much influence does it have where it can actually say, no, we are actually going to draw the line this way?
Oh.
Because, yeah, so that's what I'm, yeah.
Actually, I think the autonomy of the academy is actually very limited. So like many people have revealed in their interviews, even some officials told me it's more like a symbolic institution rather than a real, important power holder or important actor in the decision-making process in terms of determining the policies of the government. So it is really more symbolic, I would say, and it is really as a way for the government to offer something to the artists. So the artists can feel certain, political recognition or some identity there. But I do want to say their status as academician makes them more successful economically. Because what I heard in China nowadays is that many people want to buy the artist's work because many of them want to bribe. They want to bribe officials by buying those works, and they will say this is a work by such and such, an academician of the art academy something. So that works pretty well.
So that's the influence.
Yes. Yes, I.
Yeah, my question relates to a number of others that have been raised. I'm wondering whether the sort of strange hybrid of a centralized one-party state on the one hand and rapidly marketizing economy on the other doesn't create an opening for Chinese artists who reject both as artists, who reject both state socialism and commodification, to an opportunity to find a way aesthetically to express a vision of a third way that goes beyond either.
Right.
And that relates to Dick's question about what the Chinese artists have to offer the world.
Right. And that's a question people have been constantly struggling with and trying to find answers here. Yeah, but I really don't think I can really, offer an answer to your question because that's really something I have been thinking about for a long time, and not only me, but many Chinese artists and curators. So whether they can really find a third way or the Chinese way, but with a more global vision here. So yeah, I don't think I can really answer the question, but yeah, I know it echoes to some of the discussion, and thanks. Yes.
Just a quick follow-up question on where the red line is drawn. Was the case of the photographer who was taking the pictures of the prostitute, that didn't really seem like a red line case, or is that a
Right.
red line case?
I guess that case is not really as political as the red line cases because he didn't really say anything bad about the party or about the major officials. However, some artists also told me the party or the government doesn't want to see the dark side being exposed in the artworks. And for some issue like prostitution or something or corruption, it is obviously the dark side. That's something the government doesn't want people to emphasize too much in the works. So that's why it was also, being challenged.
So anything that's considered the dark side like that, they basically can't sell this
Exactly.
work domestically?
Yes, that's what that's
Pretty
what's
severe
from what they told me.
restriction. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It's a pretty severe kind
Yes.
of restriction, I would think.
Yeah. So like what we see in the case here, you can actually still do this kind of art. You just cannot really publicize your work. Yeah, I think that's a pity because lots of works, they're really great and very intriguing.
So what are the channels for somebody who then wants to try to sell their work internationally? Or I'm just curious how they would go about doing that.
They have to find some patrons abroad, and some of them work with some art agencies abroad. or some of them actually work with, actually lots of international institutions or curators, they're interested in contemporary Chinese arts, especially interested in some of the young artists. They would go to those places and just to see their works. So some of them handle the issue at the individual level, and some of them, if they are more well known, they would have some institutional support from some organizations or foundations abroad.
Well, join me in thanking Yue, and everyone is also invited to a reception.
All right.
Oh, really?
When you say that the deadline is coming,
In all of my cases,
one of the things about that is that virtually all the people
forward to the workshop.
Beyond the regular.
Have you read the book? No, I thought I would listen to it. And then I read it.
That I feel like this work because I had questions before, but then some of the questions are really important.
one of the things that
I know, I'll meet you in there.
you have to recognize that art is kind of a self. Most artists,